Prior to Black Label, there was Vertigo Comics, an imprint established in 1993. It was specifically intended to publish all the oddball, mature titles in DC's lineup. Concurrently, it expanded into other, more experimental areas of comic book work. The focus was on mature material and themes of an adult nature. And for the remainder of the 90s, it was the place for creators to write and draw challenging work that catered to an audience that enjoyed imaginative fiction that didn't rely on superheroes. Obviously, not everything with a Vertigo label on it was good. Some work was outright bad and incomprehensible. Such is the nature of any creative publishing venture. As a housekeeping detail, I'm not reviewing all the regular ongoing series, such as Sandman, Swamp Thing, Animal Man, or Shade the Changing Man, nor any new ongoing series, such as Sandman Mystery Theater. Those ongoing series deserve their own dedicated video. This is strictly focused on any miniseries or one-shot that debuted in 1993. Alright, the boring details are out of the way. Let me quickly plug this channel before getting to the reviews. If you're new and you like what you see, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. If you want to go a step further and directly support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description. As always, thank you for watching. Now on with the video. Every 100 years, Death of the Endless takes a mortal form as a way to experience and appreciate what it's like being human. Story-wise, it's of a quality you would expect from Neil Gaiman. That being said, it's not an essential Sandman story. It simply addresses a question some may have about the perky personality of Death. Why is she so kind and caring towards the people she escorts into the afterlife? Personally, I don't think that's a question that needed an answer. At the same time, I cannot deny it's handled well, even though the ending and the events that occur are a bit obvious. The danger that's present is rather diminished by the fact that Death is, well, Death of the Endless. Gaiman does his best to make the reader wonder if the woman in the story is Death, or whether she's delusional. But that's a part of the premise I never bought into. In the end, I didn't love it nor did I hate it, but it's definitely a valid exploration of Death's character and motivation. Like some early Vertigo titles, this is a highly odd approach to the superhero genre. The story revolves around Michael Smith, an average, rather boring person who survives day to day by remaining average and boring. His life takes on a radical change with the appearance of a superhero from a comic book he used to adore, Enigma. Enigma saves Michael's life from an attack by a supervillain known as the Truth. And, well, as one can probably tell immediately, this is a metaphor-heavy story. Following this rescue, Michael engages in a journey of self-discovery to unravel the mystery of the sudden appearance of this previously fictional superhero. As the title suggests, this is an enigmatic story. It comes to a conclusion that is open to interpretation. Depending on one's taste, the ending may be a bit frustrating or can feel like a suitable endpoint that doesn't require further elaboration. Along with the metaphor-heavy story, there's a lot of interesting elements to the series. It has a narrative device that is quite clever, and it isn't revealed until the final pages. One could suggest this narrative device puts the authenticity of the story into question. That is, there's no way the narrator could be aware of the events that occur in the story. So it could be argued, this is a story created on the spot by an unreliable narrator. Enigma also maintains a very surreal but grounded tone throughout the series. This is enhanced by Duncan Fegredo's stark but expressive artwork. Overall, one could suggest the theme is one concerning flexibility or change, or perhaps the acceptance of flexibility or change in one's life. The title character is Judy Tanner, an assassin for a secret organization of amoral hedonists known as the Order. Basically, they engage in all manner of socially unacceptable, self-indulgent depravity. The Order is represented by Patrick, who appears to be in charge of recruiting a secret operative known as the Extremist. Judy's husband was the prior Extremist. This is a secret she discovers after he is killed in front of her. Patrick seduces Judy with the promise that he will help her find her husband's killer if she assumes the role of the Extremist. Like a lot of Peter Milligan's stories, this is a twisty, uniquely structured story. Despite the theme, its tone is subdued and measured. It's not an over-the-top examination of a personality driven to explore their most severe capabilities. There's a lot of subtle character detail to unpack. Ted McKeever's artwork is very suitable to the material. It's unique and expressive, with a lot of impressionistic line work. Also, the design of the mask, with the typical bondage O-ring affixed over the face in an expressionistic smile, is amazingly perfect. Since this is a very early addition to the Vertigo catalog, it isn't as explicit as later content from this imprint. Thematically, it gently pushes the boundaries, but the language and depictions of sex and violence are quite tame. Notorious bounty hunter Jonah Hex encounters a strange group of wandering performers who have a thing for stealing corpses. I've always had a thing for Joe R. Lansdale's writing. His work has a unique quality of horror, imagination, and appropriate levels of humor. What he may excel at is mixing different genres together seamlessly, in this case, westerns and horror. It is a nearly perfect blend of the two, which results in a comic that is straight up excellent. There are a few scenes where believability is stretched a bit thin, but if one is enjoying the ride anyway, they won't stand out and be distracting. As a novelist who uses very tight sentences in his work, Lansdale's distinct style is ideal for a comic book script. Furthermore, it's fun, respectful of the character's history, and doesn't shy away from showing the less savory parts of life in the Old West. It strips away the romanticized ideal that prior work in novels and movies added to that period of North American history. There's also a recurring joke that will sound quite familiar. When asked about how his face got scarred, Hex gives a different, usually sarcastic answer. For those wondering, the origin of the scar can be found in issue 8 of the original series. Briefly, Jonah cheated in a death duel with his Apache brother. As a punishment, his face was disfigured, so he would always be seen as both good and evil. Now you know. You're welcome. What also makes this series work is Timothy Truman's detailed artwork. It looks and feels like a dirty western setting at all times. It has an aesthetic authenticity to it that makes the series feel very real and very grounded. In other words, the text and artwork go perfectly together to create a dusty world of danger, grime, and, well, animated corpses. The series focuses on an ancient being called Merwin, who provides shelter for certain humans in need. Merwin is literally gender fluid, appearing as male to some and female to others. And the room they occupy in their home is reality fluid, appearing as different, usually rustic locations. They are, very clearly, an angelic type of being. However, Merwin takes in a junkie, and when their efforts to reform that person fail, they slip into a deep depression. Over time, Merwin decides it's time to finally give up their presence on Earth and move on. As I will mention in the next review, every now and again the writer, J.M.D. Mateus, will commit to a bleak, New Age spirituality type of story that ends on a slightly ambiguous but hopeful beat. And that's what the last one is. It's morose, with a gentle third-act twist that puts all the prior events into a different context. It's quite atmospheric, and Dan Sweetman's artwork works very well to enhance the material. Overall, it's a character piece with a somewhat limited appeal. It's not something I hated, but I didn't love it either. Every now and again, the writer, J.M.D. Mateus, writes an existential story about life. However, Mercy is not really a story. It's more of an essay that explores a few variations of mercy that manifest in subtle ways. Paul Johnson's artwork is rather expressive, and he does his best to enhance the tone D. Mateus is trying to create. But in the end, it's really uninteresting on just about every level. Scarab is about an old forgotten hero coming out of retirement to save his wife, who has been lost for decades in a bizarre realm known as the Labyrinth. Originally, this series began as a pitch to revive and update Dr. Fate, but the editor didn't think the changes fit the established character, so he was reworked as Scarab, which was probably for the best. Perhaps the best way to describe this series is to say it's a mix of Alan Moore's poetic, elliptical writing from the latter days of Swamp Thing, mixed with Grant Morrison's oddball sensibilities from Doom Patrol. It is an overwritten mess of abstract sentences, symbolic language, and rather thin plots. It's a style of writing that I find tedious and unskilled. Originally, like the Enigma, Sebastian O was intended for a never-launched Disney comic book imprint, Touchstone Comics. When Disney changed their minds and cancelled that project, this title moved over to Vertigo. The series is a mix of Victorian steampunk and dandy culture, with a basic revenge story at its core. The main character, Sebastian O, is an aesthetically motivated, Oscar Wilde type of character. Much like Wilde himself, Sebastian O ends up in prison for essentially being a pervert. Eventually, he escapes to exact a suitable level of revenge on the man responsible for his imprisonment, Lord Lavender. The supporting cast, who assists Sebastian O, are all intentionally oddball high society weirdos. They indulge in aesthetics, and they are dedicated to various perverse forms of leisure. For the most part, this is a straightforward short story. Unlike a lot of Grant Morrison's work, it doesn't push boundaries or challenge one's perception of reality. It's a quiet, plot-driven narrative that moves along at a reasonable pace. In the end, Sebastian O is all about style and looking fabulous while one commits murder. It's somewhat like a pretentious action movie, where the hero has an ironically clever line or catchphrase to say while executing their foe. It's also a checklist of socially radical behavior from those that can afford the luxury of being outsiders. Unfortunately, it's not a compelling story, and the lead character, Sebastian O, is a little flat and unlikable. As a brief, slightly edgy action story, it's decent reading material for a lazy Sunday afternoon. Otherwise, Morrison fans may love it, but it might not work for others. A young man, John Oakes, ends up in prison where he meets the old Green Lantern villain, the Tattooed Man. Over the next 5 years, John allows this man to cover him with ink. Upon release, John becomes a famous, renowned tattoo artist. Everything is great until his customers begin to die. This is a very brisk story that gets to where it's going without filling in volumes of detail. It gently delves into the culture surrounding tattoos and the mysticism concerning their application. Back in the early 90s, tattoos, piercings, and branding were just starting to be a thing, and this miniseries seems to tap into that emerging popular interest. It gently contrasts how in North American culture, tattoos are generally decorative and expressive, but in other parts of the world, it's highly symbolic, ritualistic, and filled with cultural meaning. It's another series I didn't love or hate. This comic took the character in a completely different direction, deciding to focus on the geek aspect of the character, specifically a circus geek. To be honest, I don't actually see the point of this comic at all, but to be fair, Rachel Pollack's writing has never appealed to me. A woman begins her first shift at an asylum and encounters a series of strange events that lead her to believe the asylum isn't what it pretends to be. The story has a somewhat interesting premise with a slightly awkward setup, and it ends quite well with a twist that is very appropriate. Overall, it works as intended, but not very well. It stands out that the female protagonist, once introduced to the bizarre location, doesn't choose to immediately leave, which would be the normal, expected reaction. While this does make sense in the end, at first it seems very forced. Critically speaking, it's fine, but it could have used a brutal second or third draft to smooth over the rough spots. Vertigo's first year is definitely a mix of material, with a surprising amount of stories based on DC properties: Jonah Hex, Death, Phantom Stranger, The Tattooed Man, and Brother Power. One could also include Scarab, since it began as a Dr. Fate proposal. Basically, Vertigo isn't straying too far from the material that led to its creation in the first place. So one can look at this first year as Vertigo still looking for its identity. There's not a lot to be said about this listing, other than the top 4 spots are all solid titles. Critically speaking, Enigma may be better than Jonah Hex, but Hex was a pure delight to read, so it gets the top spot. The titles in spots 5 through 8 are fine, but they likely have a limited appeal. The bottom 3 I probably wouldn't suggest to anyone. Well, that's it. That's Vertigo's first year. What do you think? Has anyone actually read any of these titles? Let me know in the comments. All that's left to say is thank you for watching, or listening, whatever the case may be. Thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and on YouTube. If you have the ways and means, please help out. I'm about a third of the way to my overall goal of being able to do this full time. so any and all support is greatly appreciated. Extra special thanks to Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, Marc-Antoine Martinetti, Johnny Lim, Aaron Segman, Steve White, Taylor Dull, Zach Kleinfelter, Matt Marino, and Corey Drew. You are all justified and ancient.